I'm taking the house and the company. Marissa can keep the useless paintings. Lucas Haverhill's smug voice cut through the Lakeshore Drive office tower, and laughter erupted from Elaine and Sylvia, echoing his scorn. To them, I wasn't a businesswoman. I was a joke, a shadow erased by years of their contempt. My name is Marissa Claybourne. For a decade, I carried Claybourne Industries while Lucas chased failed startups. They never saw me and never respected me. But here's the thing about being underestimated. It builds a fire no one can put out. And as Lucas smirked, his victory certain in his eyes, the lawyer cleared his throat, and the evidence in his hands was about to shatter their world. My name is Marissa Claybourne, and in my family I was never the chosen one. If you asked anyone who carried the Claybourne name with pride, they would point straight at my older brother, Lucas Haverhill. He was tall, smooth-talking, and always dressed like he belonged on the cover of a business magazine. To relatives like my Aunt Elaine or my stepmother Sylvia, Lucas was the golden child. But golden children often shine only on the surface. For 10 years, I was the one who kept Claybourne Industries alive. I walked the steel yards in Chicago before dawn, sparks flying from welders as forklifts roared across the concrete. I negotiated with suppliers who threatened to walk, balanced payroll on my Dell laptop long after midnight, and stood in union halls convincing workers to stay when they had every reason to leave. Lucas, he was chasing failed startups. He called them ventures when he wanted to impress people at dinner parties, but to me they were just excuses for him to spend money he didn't earn. Miami 1 month, Vegas the next. A photo with a cocktail in hand while I was standing in safety goggles and steel-toed boots, praying the numbers lined up by Friday. At family gatherings, my work didn't matter. Elaine would lean over her glass and whisper, "Marissa is organized, but Lucas, he has leadership in his blood." Sylvia would nod as if the verdict was final, sipping Chardonnay while I cleared the dishes. To them, I wasn't a businesswoman. I was a shadow erased by years of their contempt. They never saw me, and they never respected me. What they didn't realize was that the company they dismissed as Lucas's birthright had already become mine in every way that counted. I was the one who saved a multi-million-dollar contract by driving across Chicago to meet a furious client in person. I was the one who held 30 angry workers in a strike meeting until midnight, promising them more than words, promising them change. I was the one who caught an accounting error that could have cost us half a year's profit, while Lucas was busy chasing investors who never called him back. My father, Richard Claybourne, watched quietly. He didn't shower me with praise, but he gave me the hardest jobs, and he noticed when I delivered. Still, in public, he let Lucas carry the spotlight. And so the story was written, Lucas the heir, Marissa the helper. So I stayed silent. I let them underestimate me. I bottled the insults, the laughter, the way Sylvia's smirk cut deeper than words, and I told myself that one day my work would speak louder than their scorn. That day arrived in a mahogany-paneled conference room high above Lakeshore Drive in downtown Chicago. My father had passed, and the estate was being divided. Lucas sat across from me, grinning like a man who already owned it all. He claimed the house. He claimed the company. He claimed the legacy itself. Elaine and Sylvia laughed on cue, their voices sharp and practiced, as if the script had been rehearsed for years. But I kept my hands folded in my lap, my face calm. Because unlike them, I knew something they didn't. The evidence was already written. And soon the lawyer sitting across from us would read it out loud. The conference room on Lakeshore Drive was quiet for half a second after Lucas's declaration. Then the laughter started. Elaine's voice carried first, sharp and theatrical. "Of course Lucas will run the company. He's the one with the vision." Sylvia chimed in, her tone dripping with certainty. "Richard always said Lucas had a gift. Marissa should be grateful she's at least getting something sentimental." Their laughter echoed through the paneled walls, bouncing back at me like a cruel chorus. I sat in silence, my black dress plain against their polished suits and jeweled brooches. To them, I was the afterthought. The girl with numbers in her head and no business running a legacy. Lucas leaned back in his chair, folding his hands across his chest. He looked every bit the heir he believed himself to be. "You know, Marissa," he said with a smirk, "paperwork is important, but leadership, that's something you're born with. Father always said the business needed strong men at the helm." Strong men. the words hit harder than he realized. My father, Richard Claybourne, had never said them to me, at least not in front of anyone else. He gave me responsibility, yes, but the praise always landed in Lucas's lap. And now, even in death, the echo of those years filled the room. I clenched my jaw until I tasted the copper edge of blood. Not a word. Not yet. Trevor Ashland, my cousin barely out of college, laughed too loudly, like he was auditioning for Lucas's approval. Hey, maybe Marissa can keep organizing filing cabinets while we run the company. Every empire needs a secretary. The smugness in his tone made my stomach twist. Sylvia's hand brushed Lucas's arm, a mother proud of her son. But Lucas wasn't my father's son. He was Sylvia's from her first marriage, carrying the Haverhill name with pride as if it made him more polished, more deserving. And still everyone in that room bent toward him, as though my father's bloodline ran thicker in him than it did in me. The lawyer, Harvey Linscott, cleared his throat, but no one noticed. Lucas's voice dominated the space. It's obvious, isn't it? I'll take the house, the company, the assets. Marissa can keep the family paintings. She always did like little hobbies. Hobbies. He said it like my life's work was nothing more than a pastime. I kept my hands folded in my lap, breathing slowly through the anger pressing against my ribs. Years of being ignored had taught me control. To defend myself in that moment would have been like throwing a stone at a tidal wave. It would only prove their point: emotional, unfit, undeserving. So I sat still, every insult etching itself deeper into memory. Elaine dabbed at her eyes with a tissue that stayed bone dry. Sylvia patted Lucas's shoulder, beaming. Trevor shook his head in mock sympathy, whispering just loud enough for me to hear. Poor Marissa. Always second place. A second place. That was the script they had written for me before I even had a chance to prove myself. But scripts can be rewritten. Harvey cleared his throat again, louder this time. The laughter thinned, the air shifting as his calm voice cut across the room. If I may, he began, his eyes locking on mine for the briefest moment. There are details in Mr. Claybourne's estate that require clarification. The room stilled. Lucas adjusted his tie, irritation flickering in his eyes. Elaine frowned, her tissue frozen midair. Sylvia's smile faltered. I lifted my chin ever so slightly, because I knew that what came next would be the first crack in the perfect facade Lucas had built for himself. The lawyer's voice faded into the background for a moment, and my mind carried me back to the years no one in that room had ever cared to remember. I was 24 when my father, Richard Claybourne, first handed me the keys to Claybourne Industries after hours. Walk the floor, he said. See what it feels like when the machines sleep. The factory was dark, the smell of steel and oil hanging thick in the air. I walked past rows of Caterpillar forklifts, stacks of raw metal, and sparks dying on the floor like stars fading out. In that silence, I realized what my father meant. Leadership wasn't about speeches or suits. It was about carrying weight no one else wanted. From that night forward, I carried it. When our largest supplier threatened to cut ties over late payments, I sat in a drafty office with nothing but a pot of burnt coffee and convinced them to stay. I broke down spreadsheets line by line, showing where we could shift resources. It wasn't glamorous, but it saved a multi-million-dollar deal. When a labor strike nearly shut us down, I walked into a union hall filled with 30 furious workers. I didn't wear pearls or high heels. I wore steel-toed boots and stood with them at eye level. I promised better benefits and I delivered. Not through empty words, but through numbers, renegotiated contracts, and the kind of relentless nights that burn holes in your soul. Lucas wasn't there for any of it. He was in Miami, posting photos on rooftops with hashtags about entrepreneur life. And a month later, he was in Los Angeles, pitching another startup idea to investors who stopped returning his calls. To the family, it didn't matter. They saw his smile on social media, heard his easy laugh at holiday dinners, and believed he was destined for success. I became the invisible scaffolding. Every paycheck signed, every deal salvaged, every supplier kept in line, all of it bore my fingerprints. But at Thanksgiving, Elaine would raise her glass to Lucas and say, "The future looks bright with him leading." Sylvia would squeeze his hand like he was a king waiting for a crown. No one toasted me. I told myself it didn't matter. That one day, the records I kept, the receipts no one bothered to read, would tell the story better than I ever could. I saved every contract, every email, every detail. Not because I was paranoid, but because I knew the day would come when proof would matter more than charisma. It was exhausting. Some nights I sat in my apartment staring at the city lights, wondering why I kept going. But then I'd think about the workers whose kids depended on those paychecks. I'd think about my father, who had started with nothing but a single truck and a tool belt. And I would remind myself I wasn't doing it for applause. I was doing it because without me, everything would collapse. The weight of those years pressed against me even as I sat in that conference room. Lucas was laughing. Elaine and Sylvia were nodding along. Trevor smirked like a child playing dress-up. But I knew something they didn't. Every late-night email, every salvaged deal, every ounce of sweat, they were all part of the record. And that record was sitting in Harvey Linscott's folder, waiting for the right moment to surface. Hospitals have a way of shrinking even the strongest men. My father, Richard Claybourne, had built Claybourne Industries from the ground up. His hands were once calloused from steel and sweat, but by the time I sat beside him at St. Mary's Hospital, those same hands trembled against the white sheets. The machines hummed softly, a steady rhythm of beeps and breaths, and I knew I was running out of time. He opened his eyes and found me sitting there. "Marissa," he whispered, his voice fragile but certain. "You've been my right hand for years." I leaned closer, squeezing his hand. "Don't talk about work, Dad. Just rest." But he wasn't the kind of man who rested easily. He kept looking toward the leather briefcase sitting in the corner of the room. That briefcase had followed him everywhere: board meetings, job sites, even family dinners. It was more than just papers and contracts. It was his life, his legacy. "Your grandmother's paintings," he murmured. "They're not just for memory. There's more to them than sentiment." At first I thought he was delirious, caught in a haze of medication. But the weight in his eyes told me otherwise. He wanted me to understand, to pay attention, to carry something beyond the company itself. I nodded, but before I could ask what he meant, his strength faded. The words fell away, leaving me with more questions than answers. The days that followed blurred together: funeral arrangements, condolences from people who had never set foot in our factory, whispered conversations about inheritance. Lucas flew in 2 days late, tan from a trip he called business development. Sylvia smothered him in sympathy, while Elaine whispered about how hard it must be to lose a father when you were destined to take his place. They didn't notice that I was the one who signed every final paycheck before the funeral. They didn't see me on the phone with suppliers, keeping the wheels turning while grief pressed down like iron. In quiet moments, I thought about my father's words. The paintings. Not just sentiment. I remembered being a little girl, sitting with my grandmother as she explained the history behind each piece, the brushstrokes, the signatures, the way certain canvases were passed down like secrets. I had always listened politely, never realizing those stories might one day matter. Now, in the stillness of the hospital room replaying in my mind, I wondered what exactly my father had hidden inside that legacy. One night, after the funeral, I went back to the factory. The air was cold, the machines silent. I walked the floor alone, hearing his voice in my head. "See what it feels like when the machines sleep?" I pressed my hand against a steel beam, grounding myself in the weight of what he had built. He had trusted me to carry it forward, not Lucas, not anyone else. And if he had gone so far as to transfer the company in secret, as I now suspected, then everything Lucas was bragging about in that conference room was nothing but smoke. Still, the paintings haunted me. His eyes when he said it. The insistence that I pay attention. By the time I returned to the mahogany-paneled office on Lakeshore Drive, I knew one thing for certain: my father had left me more than responsibility. He had left me clues. And when the lawyer cleared his throat that day, I realized those clues were about to come to light. The laughter still lingered in the air when Harvey Linscott, the lawyer, finally spoke. His voice was calm but firm, the kind of voice that silenced rooms without raising its volume. "Actually," Harvey began, adjusting his glasses, "there is a matter we need to clarify before we proceed with the estate." Lucas frowned, irritation flickering in his eyes. What's there to clarify? Father left the business to me. Everyone knows that. Harvey opened a leather folder, the pages thick with signatures and stamps. That is not correct. In fact, Claybourne Industries is not part of this estate at all. The room froze. Elaine's hand, holding a tissue, hovered midair. Sylvia blinked as if she had misheard. Even Trevor leaned forward, his smirk faltering. Lucas barked out a laugh. What do you mean it's not part of the estate? Of course it is. It's his company. Harvey shook his head slowly. It was his company. 6 years ago, Mr. Richard Claybourne transferred full ownership of Claybourne Industries to his daughter, Marissa Claybourne. The silence that followed was heavier than steel. Lucas's smile cracked, his voice rising. That's impossible. I'm his son. I'm supposed to inherit the business. You are not Mr. Claybourne's son, Harvey said evenly. You are Sylvia's son from her first marriage. Mr. Claybourne respected you, but he entrusted the company to the one who had already been running it. Every eye in the room turned toward me. I kept my expression neutral, though inside a slow, burning satisfaction spread through my chest. For years, I had been dismissed as a bookkeeper. For years, they had laughed while I carried every burden. And now the truth was finally laid bare. Lucas's face turned red, then pale. This is some kind of mistake. She doesn't know how to run a company. She files papers. I've been preparing my whole life. Elaine's voice trembled. Surely Richard would never, but Harvey cut her off. The documents are clear. Since 2017, Marissa Claybourne has been the sole legal owner of Claybourne Industries. Every decision, every contract, every success of the last 6 years, hers. I finally allowed myself a small smile. It wasn't arrogance. It was relief. Validation. The receipts I had guarded for so long were now undeniable. Trevor shifted uncomfortably, his earlier mockery gone. Sylvia's face hardened, the proud mother suddenly cornered. Elaine dabbed at her eyes again, but no tears came. Lucas slammed his hand on the table. This is outrageous. She tricked him somehow. Father would never have done this. I leaned forward, my voice steady. You mean the father who was holding my hand in the hospital while you were on a beach in California? The father who watched me negotiate contracts and keep the company alive while you were chasing failed startups? That father? His mouth opened, but no words came. Harvey cleared his throat again. We can continue with the distribution of the personal estate if you are ready. But the matter of the company is settled. Claybourne Industries belongs entirely to Marissa. At the weight of his words filled the room, pressing down on every laugh that had been aimed at me minutes earlier. I sat straighter, folding my hands once more, and let the silence stretch. For the first time in my life, they saw me not as a shadow, not as a secretary, but as the rightful owner of the empire they had all taken for granted. And this was only the beginning. Harvey's announcement hung in the air like smoke no one could wave away. Lucas sat back in his chair, stunned into silence, and for the first time in my life I saw doubt creep across his face. But Harvey wasn't finished. He straightened the papers before him and said, Now we turn to the personal estate. Elaine leaned forward, eager to hear the list. Sylvia adjusted her pearl necklace, her expression tight. Lucas regained some of his bluster, muttering, At least the house will be mine. Harvey cleared his throat. Riverside Estate, the family home, does indeed pass to Lucas Haverhill. However, it carries an outstanding mortgage of $450,000. The responsibility for that debt is his. The smug confidence drained from Lucas's face. Debt? That can't be right. Father owned that house outright. Harvey shook his head. The records are clear. Renovations, loans, and business expenses were tied to the property. The mortgage balance remains. Trevor let out a low whistle, quickly silenced by Elaine's sharp glare. Harvey continued. In addition, Lucas inherits Mr. Claybourne's personal investments. However, most of those funds were withdrawn in recent years to cover losses from Lucas's ventures. What remains is minimal. I bit the inside of my cheek to keep from smiling. I remembered those years, watching my father quietly cover debts so Lucas wouldn't face public embarrassment. Now the truth sat on paper, undeniable. Lucas shifted in his chair, his voice rising. "This is ridiculous. He promised me the estate." "He left you the estate," Harvey replied calmly, "and everything attached to it." Sylvia reached for Lucas's hand, but he pulled it away, his jaw clenched tight. Harvey shuffled the next set of documents. As for Marissa Claybourne, she inherits the art collection passed down from her grandmother. Elaine scoffed loudly. "Paintings? That's hardly compensation for a house and a legacy." Lucas barked out a bitter laugh. "See, she gets the decorations. I get the real assets." Harvey adjusted his glasses, a faint smile touching the corners of his mouth. The collection was appraised last year at $720,000. The room erupted in silence. Even the air conditioner seemed to hush. Elaine blinked rapidly, her tissue falling to her lap. Sylvia gasped, then pressed her lips into a thin line. Trevor muttered under his breath, "$720,000 for paintings?" Lucas's laughter died instantly. He stared at me as though the ground beneath him had shifted. "That can't be true." "It is true," Harvey said, sliding the appraisal across the table. The collection includes several rare 19th century pieces and a complete set of mid-20th century works. They are considered highly valuable by collectors. I kept my expression neutral, but inside I remembered my father's words in the hospital. "They're not just for memory." Lucas shook his head, voice cracking. "So she gets a company worth millions and paintings worth nearly $1 million more, while I get a house drowning in debt?" No one answered. Elaine shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Sylvia stared at the table. Even Trevor had nothing to say. I folded my hands, calm and steady. For years they had laughed at me, dismissed me as invisible. Now, one by one, the scales were tipping. Harvey closed the folder with deliberate care. "That concludes the reading of the personal estate. Unless there are objections, we will proceed with the documentation." Lucas opened his mouth to argue again, but no words came. He had no ground left. And I knew the moment had come to show them what 6 years of my work really looked like. The room should have ended in silence, but Lucas couldn't let it go. His chair scraped against the hardwood as he stood, voice sharp with desperation. "This has to be a mistake. Marissa doesn't know how to run a company. She's just the bookkeeper." The word cut deep, though I had heard it for years. Bookkeeper. As if my life's work was reduced to filing papers. I took a slow breath and opened the leather portfolio I had carried in with me. My fingers slid across neatly stacked folders, the records of the last 6 years. I hadn't planned on using them. I thought Harvey's words would be enough. But Lucas's arrogance deserved a different kind of answer. I laid the first document on the table. This is the quarterly report from 2018, when one of our largest clients threatened to cancel a $20 million contract. My signatures are on every negotiation. I kept that deal alive while you were in Los Angeles pitching an app that never launched. Elaine shifted in her seat, Sylvia's lips pressed tighter, Lucas's face burned red. I placed the next file on top. Here's the union agreement from 2019. 30 workers ready to walk out. I rewrote the benefits package, kept every single one on payroll, and prevented a strike that would have shut the plant for months. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The receipts spoke louder than I ever could. Trevor leaned forward despite himself, eyes scanning the pages. "You kept all this?" "Yes," I said simply, "because in this family, if you don't have proof, your work disappears." Harvey nodded, his tone approving. "Your father mentioned you were thorough, Marissa. I didn't realize how thorough until now." Lucas slammed his fist against the table. "You think a pile of papers makes you a leader? I went to business school. I have an MBA. I met his eyes, calm. "From a program you barely finished. 5 years for a 2-year degree. Meanwhile, I grew Claybourne Industries 45% during the same period. That's leadership." The words landed like a hammer. Elaine's tissue finally tore in her hands. Sylvia looked away. Trevor swallowed hard. I pulled out the final sheet, a graph of revenue growth, black and white, undeniable. "This is what Claybourne Industries looks like under my management. Profits up, contracts secure, expansion into eco-friendly steel already underway." I closed the portfolio and folded my hands again. "Call me a bookkeeper if you want, but these numbers don't lie. They tell the story you never cared to hear." Lucas's mouth opened, but nothing came out. His smirk was gone, replaced by the panic of a man who had built his entire identity on entitlement. For the first time, the family didn't look at him. They looked at me, not with love, not yet, but with recognition, with the dawning realization that I wasn't invisible. Harvey cleared his throat gently. The documentation is thorough. There is no question of ownership or competence. Miss Claybourne has been and continues to be the rightful head of Claybourne Industries. The sentence hung like a verdict. I sat back, my heart steady. For years I had waited for this moment, the moment when the receipts proved what words never could. But even as relief washed over me, I knew this wasn't the end. Lucas wasn't done fighting, and the next move he made would push him past desperation into humiliation. The documents sat in a neat stack before me, black ink against white paper, evidence that no one could dismiss. Lucas's eyes darted across the table, searching for a lifeline, but none came. Elaine avoided his gaze, Sylvia clutched her pearls, and Trevor stared at the floor. For years, Lucas had leaned on their approval, confident they would shield him from consequence. Now their silence was deafening. I leaned forward, my voice steady. Lucas, as the owner of Claybourne Industries, I want to thank you for your years of minimal contribution. A ripple of tension broke across the room. Elaine gasped softly. Trevor's mouth twitched, as if he wasn't sure whether to laugh or hide. Lucas's face flushed. You can't talk to me like that. Father always said I would take over. I met his glare. You talked about taking over. He listened. There's a difference. Harvey adjusted his glasses, his tone professional. The legal documents are clear. The company has belonged to Marissa for 6 years. Under her leadership, its value has risen 45%. The words landed like a hammer. Lucas's hands trembled. He tried to laugh it off, but the sound cracked in his throat. Elaine shifted uncomfortably. Well, surely we can all find a way to work together. No, I said firmly. My voice was calm, but it carried the weight of every year I had been ignored. Lucas had his chance. He chose to mock me instead of learning the business. That choice is his to live with. Lucas stood abruptly, knocking his chair against the wall. This is a setup. She manipulated Father. She manipulated all of you. Harvey's eyes narrowed. Mr. Haverhill, be careful with your accusations. Every transfer was notarized, every record filed legally. Your father acted with full clarity. Lucas's bluster collapsed. His shoulders sagged as if the fight drained out of him. He looked at Sylvia, searching for support, but she had none to give. Even she couldn't argue against signatures, contracts, and 6 years of growth under my watch. For the first time, I saw something new in Lucas's eyes. Not arrogance, not superiority, fear. I stood slowly, smoothing my skirt. You wanted the house, Lucas? It's yours, along with the debt. You wanted Father's investments. They're gone, drained by your own ventures. And you laughed when I was left with the paintings. But those paintings are worth nearly $1 million. So tell me again who won. Silence, heavy, undeniable silence. Trevor coughed nervously. Elaine whispered, This isn't how it was supposed to go. I turned toward Harvey. Thank you, I believe we're done here. Harvey nodded. Unless there are further objections, the reading is complete. I gathered my folder, the one filled with 6 years of proof, and rose from my chair. My heels clicked against the polished floor, the sound sharp in the stillness. At the door, I paused. Lucas stood in the corner, pale and trembling, the golden boy stripped of his crown. I looked back once, and Lucas, Claybourne Industries isn't hiring. The words hit harder than any document could. His face crumpled, and for a moment I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Then I stepped out, the door closing behind me, leaving Lucas to sit in the ruins of his imagined victory. But humiliation in a conference room was only the beginning. The world outside was waiting, and there, consequences would spread further than he could imagine. 3 months later, the echoes of that conference room still followed Lucas wherever he went. Word traveled fast in Chicago's business circles. Everyone knew the golden heir had been left with debt, not a legacy. Riverside Estate became an anchor. The sprawling property looked impressive from the outside, but the mortgage payments bled him dry. The upkeep alone, landscaping, repairs, taxes, was more than he could manage. Within weeks, the pristine lawn grew patchy, the roof leaked, and the neighbors whispered about how quickly the estate was crumbling. Lucas tried to keep up appearances. He drove Father's old Ford F-150 into the city, wearing suits that no longer fit quite right. He showed up to meetings with developers who used to flatter him, only to realize they weren't interested in promises without proof. The same people who once called him the future now avoided his calls. When no one would hire him at a management level, he swallowed his pride and took a sales job at a dealership on the edge of town. For the first time, he had to survive on commission. The hours were long, the work humbling. He was no longer introducing himself as the heir to Claybourne Industries. He was the man trying to convince strangers to drive off the lot in a used sedan. At night, the house echoed with emptiness. He had no family of his own, no legacy to pass down. Only the sound of unpaid bills piling on the kitchen counter. Meanwhile, my life looked very different. Claybourne Industries was thriving. Our new eco-friendly steel division had secured coverage in the Chicago Business Journal. I had meetings lined up with city officials about infrastructure projects. For the first time in years, expansion felt possible, not risky. I drove to work in a Tesla Model 3, a symbol not of luxury but of progress. My office overlooked the river, blueprints spread across the table as I planned the future my father had trusted me to build. Employees stopped by with updates, their respect genuine, their loyalty earned. The nameplate on my desk read Marissa Claybourne, Chief Executive Officer, and every time I looked at it, I remembered the years I spent invisible. Then one morning, my assistant knocked on my door. "There's a Lucas Haverhill here to see you. Says he's your brother." I set down the blueprint in my hands. Through the glass wall, I could see him waiting. Wrinkled suit, tired eyes, posture slouched like a man who had been carrying burdens he never expected to bear. When he stepped into my office, he forced a smile. "Nice view," he said, his voice thin. "I heard you're expanding into green construction." "We are," I replied, my tone even. His gaze moved across the awards on my wall, the framed photos of completed projects, the certificates I had earned. Each one was a reminder of what I had built while he had been busy chasing illusions. Finally, he looked at me. The smirk was gone. In its place was something I had never seen before: defeat. "Marissa," he said quietly, "I need a job." The words lingered in the air, heavy with irony. I studied him, the brother who had once mocked me in front of our entire family. The man who had declared the company his by right. And now here he was, standing in my office, asking for a place at the table he had once laughed me away from. I leaned back in my chair, my expression unreadable. And as silence stretched between us, I realized this was the moment I had been waiting for. Lucas stood in front of my desk, his shoulders slumped, his eyes dull. The brother who once mocked me in front of our family was now a man stripped of everything he thought he was owed. "I need a job," he whispered. For a moment, I thought of the little girl I used to be, the one who cleared dishes while Elaine toasted him, who heard Sylvia call me a helper, who carried the company in silence while he basked in borrowed glory. That memory hardened me. I shook my head. "I'm sorry, Lucas, but Claybourne Industries isn't hiring." The words landed like a final gavel strike. His lips parted, but no sound came. He turned and left, his footsteps fading until the office door shut behind him. I leaned back in my chair and looked out at the skyline. The hum of the city matched the hum inside me, not triumph, not vengeance, but something deeper, vindication. Because the sweetest payback isn't watching someone else fall. It's standing tall in the space they swore you'd never reach. My father had seen me, my workers had trusted me. And now, the family that once laughed at me had been forced to confront the truth. I wasn't invisible. I was the leader they never expected, and that's the lesson I want you to carry. If you've ever been dismissed, if you've ever been underestimated to the point of being erased, remember this: you don't need their approval to prove your value. Keep your receipts. Keep building, because one day your evidence will speak louder than their laughter. And when that day comes, the joy won't be in watching them lose. The joy will be in finally stepping into the life you deserved all along. That's the kind of justice we share here on Heartless Revenge. If you believe in it too, subscribe, and share this story with someone who needs to be reminded that their work matters. I turned back to my desk, blueprints spread across the table, the future of Claybourne Industries in my hands. For the first time, I wasn't the invisible one. I was exactly where I was meant to be.